In the 7th century, there were 9 mosques in Medina. The first school appeared here in 622, and as the idea of schooling spread, so too did other schools. So there was Damascus had a lot of schools, 8th century Cordoba in Spain had a lot of schools, and by the late 9th century, nearly every mosque had an elementary school attached to it for the education of both boys and girls. Mosques increased from that point, so there were 3,000 of them reported in Baghdad alone in the first decades of the 10th century, and as many as 12,000 were reported in Alexandria in the 14th century, most of them with schools attached. As schools developed, they could be divided into 4 categories depending on what they taught and at what level. These were regular schools, high schools, houses of hadith, and medical schools. So regular schools, they taught general subjects, and they were the equivalent of primary schools. Students left with a primary level certificate so that they could enter high schools. Regular schools were the most common, found in every village. Darul Qurra, or the House of Readers, was a high school that taught proficiency in Arabic, in reading and reciting the Quran. The school also trained imams and muezzins. Darul Hadith, or the House of Hadith, specialized in teaching and researching the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Graduates from this school were awarded the equivalent to a university degree, so that they could work at religious institutions. The first school dedicated solely to the teaching of medicine was founded in Damascus in 1231. Before this, medical teaching was carried out in hospitals and through apprenticeships. Medical schools were not widely established until 16th century, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan. The students of law went through undergraduate training, and if they were successful, they were chosen by their master as a fellow. Only then could they go on to graduate studies, which lasted an indefinite period of time. It could be up to 20 years before they acquired their own professorial chair. The law student had to get a certificate of authorization and a license before practicing. By the 10th century, growing demand meant that teaching was actually moving away from the mosque and went initially into the teacher's house, and from there, gradually, schools developed into formal madrasas. In 1066, the Seljuks built the Nizamiya school, named after its founder, Vizier Nizam al-Mulk of Baghdad. This was the first proper school that had separate teaching building, and this became the standardized model. The introduction of papermaking technology by Chinese prisoners of war was a game changer. This happened in 751. So paper mills were developed, and for 400 years before Europe, paper was used exclusively in the Islamic world. The technology of paper made it possible for scholars to write books in large volumes, and also allowed students to start taking notes on notebooks. This was also the era of translation. So from 750 to 850 in particular, Baghdad was front and center with their House of Wisdom. In the first 100 years of the Abbasids, the Arabic reading world came into possession of Greek, Indian and Persian masterpieces, and in less than a century, it had all been translated and assimilated into society. With this translation movement came the rise of the number of doctors and lawyers and writers and teachers and judges. So this was a time full of creativity. So under the sponsorship of Caliph al-Mamun, economic support of the House of Wisdom and scholarship in general was greatly increased. It was actually quite easy for scholars and translators to make quite a good living, and living an academic life was a symbol of status. Scientific knowledge was considered so valuable that books and ancient texts were sometimes preferred as war booty rather than riches. Al-Mamun also built the first astronomical observatories in Baghdad, and he was also the first ruler to fund and monitor the progress of major research projects involving a team of scholars and scientists. The high degree of learning and scholarship in Islam naturally led to a fascination with reading, and the caliphs encouraged the development of bookshops, copyists, and book dealers in large important Islamic cities such as Damascus, Baghdad and Cordoba. By the 9th century, public libraries also became more common. As a result, Baghdad had 36 libraries and over 100 book dealers by the 13th century. In the West, the concept of the harem has been corrupted to mean something of lust and desire, somewhere with the wives and the concubines of the king would stay. However, the harem was actually more of a school, and it has nothing to do with status. Harem was simply the private part of any household, which was big enough to distinguish between private and public quarters, and it was actually an educational space. This is where women prepared for life and organised charitable events. So royal women, for example, would study art, music, literature and the Quran, and they also learned history, geography and mathematics. Elite women also participated in culturally sophisticated activity such as the recitation of poetry, the administration of inheritance and property as well. For non-royal households, the harem was still a space where the women would learn reading, the Quran and basic household tasks. One of the most famous tales of the Islamic Golden Age is the fact that the oldest existing and continually operating degree-granting educational institution in the world is the University of Qarawiyyin, founded in 859 in Fez, Morocco, by the then Princess Fatima al-Fihri. Her sister Miriam actually founded an adjacent mosque. Together, the complex became the Al-Qarawiyyin Mosque and University. But it wasn't just the university that Muslims pioneered. Muslims also institutionalized higher level education as a whole. There were entrance exams, there were challenging finals, there were degree certificates, the study circles which we mentioned before, international students and grants. In fact, there's a remarkable similarity between the teaching procedures in Muslim universities and the methods of the present day. They even had collegiate courses and prizes for proficiency in scholarship. The first university in Europe was established by the Arabs in 841 in the city of Salerno in Italy. This was just an extension of the Muslim universities in the East. And then the University of Toledo in Seville and Granada were also opened not long after. So when the students who were at the time non-Muslims from Europe, they went to the universities, they learned and they graduated and then returned to their lands, they would actually dress in the Arab or Muslim robes called thobe or qamis. And this would become an indication that this particular student graduated from the University of the Muslims. And so it was quite a big status. This imitation of wearing the Arab or Muslim garb, which is quite baggy and wide in design, has stayed with with students to this day. Jack Goody, in his book titled Islam in Europe, says that the Arabic clothing, thobe, has remained the purest and clearest sign of scholastic integrity up until this day of ours, especially during scholastic events such as debating and graduations. So this is why when we graduate from university today, we wear these gowns known as subfusk. It's said in some Arab texts that this gown that students wear when graduating come from the dress of Ibn Sina. So we don't know that for sure, but what we do know is that they definitely have their roots in Islamic tradition. They also wear the hat, the mortarboards, and even these are Islamic in nature, and they derive actually from the flat hats of the scholars who would dress the Quran on the mortar to symbolize the primacy of the scripture over the intellect. And the tassel at the back of the mortarboard was for bookmarking the pages of the Quran. So when in subfirst the students carry the mortarboard, this is a tradition based on the students carrying the Quran with them, and the right to put it on your head only comes at the end of your study, i.e. once you've graduated.